This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel, broadcasting remotely. Colonial history is required learning, but often that history in our country focuses on the early settlers and the founding fathers. How many of us remember the perspective of an enslaved person included in our school lessons? Today, Where We Live, we talk with historian and author Elizabeth Norman. She's written a book for students called Venture Smith's Colonial Connecticut. Smith documented his life in an autobiography. It's one of the earliest known books by a formerly enslaved person. And later we talk about how Connecticut is the first state in our nation to require high schools to offer courses on Black and Latino studies. First, joining me now on Zoom, Elizabeth Norman, publisher of Connecticut Explored, that's the magazine of Connecticut history, and again, the author of Venture Smith's Colonial Connecticut. Elizabeth, welcome to our show.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Later, I want to talk more about Venture's autobiography. But first, for our listeners, can you sketch the life of Venture Smith for us? Tell us a little bit about his early life.
Well, he was born in 1729 or so. We don't know the exact date, in an area of West Africa, which has also not been exactly identified, but in a place that is now the country of Ghana. His name was Brotier. He was the son of the leader of his village. And, he grew up, he was about 8 or so when what he calls an invading army of a white nation, which would be an invading army. Slavery was, practiced and prevalent in the area, kind of swept through his village, murdered his father right in front of his eyes. He was separated from his mother and his brothers and sisters and captured and taken to the coast to a well-known slave trading port, Anamabu, and put on a ship and purchased by a Robinson Mumford, who was the ship's steward, as his kind of personal investment, who renamed him Venture, very symbolically. And he survives the Middle Passage, on which many died. He doesn't talk an awful lot about that experience in his narrative, but he does say that all who survived were sold in Barbados, except for himself and 3 other enslaved people. He's brought to Newport, Rhode Island, and he lives for about a year with Robinson Mumford's sister, where he learns English, and he's there because Robinson Mumford goes back to sea. Mumford returns and then takes him to Fisher's Island, where his family has leased Fisher's Island, New York. Interestingly, Fisher's Island, though part of New York at this time in the 1740s, early in the 1600s had been owned and was still owned by the Winthrop family. And of course, John Winthrop Jr. was an early colonial governor of Connecticut. So Connecticut connection there. It's a large farm. When George Mumford dies, Captain George Mumford, Robinson's father, dies, he has as many as 25 enslaved people. So this isn't a small scale operation by any means. So Venture grows up. When he's a young man, he marries a fellow enslaved person, Meg, there in 1754. There are examples of his resistance throughout. And interestingly, shortly after he marries Meg, he runs away with, also very interestingly, an indentured Irishman and 2 other enslaved men. But he decides, they get to basically off Montauk, Long Island. He has to sort of turn in the Irishman and return. But what happens is after that is Mumford decides to sell Venture. And he sells him to, this is now Venture's 3rd owner. Robinson Mumford, meanwhile, has died, so Captain George Mumford is his owner. He sells him to Thomas Stanton II of Stonington. And Venture's separated from his wife, Meg, and his newborn daughter, Hannah. She's literally a month old.
So Elizabeth, so he would go on to have 3 people that owned him at one point or another. Before we talk more about his adult life, what was it like at that first place in Rhode Island under Mumford, this place that once had 25 enslaved people? Did he endure a lot of torture, for lack of a better term?
Well, he talks about his childhood there, and he is, at first when he's very young, he's kind of kept in the home, and he's having to stay up long nights. He's put to work. Like he talks about crushing up corn for poultry, for feed for the poultry. He has to do carting of wool. There's a lot of sheep. There's sheep farming on the farm there. What's interesting when for kids to be reading this, there's lots of clues there about what kinds of activities are happening on this farm. There's a peach orchard. He gets into some trouble at one point, and the owner says to somebody, go out to the peach orchard and cut me some whips, some pieces of orchard, sort of peach tree to use as a whips. There's dairy, there's wheat. So he talks about spending very long hours, and if he doesn't do what he's told, he's punished. So you definitely get a sense of he's there from when he's about 10 to when he's 25. The hard work, the long days, and the large number of people that are working this farm.
You mentioned that he would go on to marry Meg, who was also enslaved. What do we know about her?
Well, we know frustratingly little, except that she's working in the house, and after he's bought by Thomas Stanton in Stonington, 2 years later, Stanton buys Meg, although he does not buy Hannah. So Hannah stays with Mumford on Fisher's Island for her entire life. But Meg goes to live on the same farm with Venture, but she gets into an altercation with Mrs. Stanton, and Venture kind of intercedes or tries to kind of make the peace between them. But unfortunately, really what happens is Venture Smith ends up being beaten and chained and threatened with being sent to Barbados. And really at the end of that experience, he's sold again. So you get a little sense of Meg there, that she's also a strong person, has a strong sense of self, and this altercation with Mrs. Stanton, he doesn't say what it's about. He tries to calm things down, but you get a frustratingly little view of Meg, unfortunately. But we know, she endures a long life. He stayed married her, and they have 4 children together. They end up free together in East Haddam, and we'll talk about that later, but he pays tribute to her at the end of his life. So she's clearly an important life mate for him.
You're hearing Elizabeth Norman here on Where We Live. She's the author of Venture Smith's Colonial Connecticut. As we're learning more about Venture Smith, again, someone who was enslaved as a boy, who would end up living first in Rhode Island and then eventually in Connecticut. You mentioned, Elizabeth, that he married Meg and they had a daughter, Hannah. He was separated from them. Eventually, he would go on to purchase his freedom. Tell us that story.
He after, I guess, by the 4th or 5th owner, and lots of adventures and lots of very interesting parts of his story, he is owned by Oliver Smith of Stonington, who allows him, and I put air quotes around that, very freighted word, to work outside of the work he does for Smith to earn money. And this is something he has done throughout his life, to save money to buy his freedom. So Oliver Smith gives him a pathway to freedom by allowing him to earn the money to buy himself from Smith. And so he eventually does that, and he becomes free when he's 36 years old in 1765. He pays what he calls an exorbitant amount of money for himself from Smith, and then he sets to work to then buy the rest of his family.
Remind us what slavery looked like in our state in the 18th century, Elizabeth.
Well, it's typically described as kind of small in scale, although there are definitely examples of larger scale, little more plantation style, 20, 25, enslaved people on a farm. But typically it was a minister, which surprises a lot of people, a merchant, professional people with some money, who have purchased enslaved people, 1 or 2, typically kind of in a small scale, living in the attic or in kind of within the home, and very, kind of living closely within the kind of, typical colonial farm. I don't want to imply that that means there was a familial relationship, because it was always a relationship of oppression. But that was sort of the typical, but what's interesting, and I think what's not well understood, is enslaved people did all kinds of work. So they were very skilled at a lot of different things. They were shipbuilders. They were, they weren't just farmers, but they were shipbuilders. They had all kinds of different blacksmiths, all kinds of different skills that they attained because they were doing all of the work really of working in this colonial economy as it develops.
So tell us more about the work that Venture did after he was able to buy his freedom and eventually his wife and his sons.
Well, that's one of the kind of, I think, wonderful things about his story as he tells it, is he describes so many things about the colonial economy for anybody. He is a fisherman. He does a lot of cutting of wood, and you got to think back to how important wood was in the colonial period. It heated. It was your cooking fuel, your heating. It was the way that, it was your building material. It was made into barrel staves. Everything was shipped in barrels. So he does a lot of wood cutting. He threshes grain. He grows watermelons. He has a load of clams at one point. So, fishing, farming, wood trade, and very much in the southern maritime colonial economy. So between Connecticut, Rhode Island, Long Island, this is a whole area that he's operating in.
And tell us more about how he was able to eventually have property and be successful. You said he went on many adventures.
He did. He went on a whaling voyage at one point. Well, because he saves his money. He works really hard. He saves his money and he buys property. And what's also interesting about that is he doesn't always have all of the money to purchase the property. In this period, another very interesting aspect that he tells us about is this is a time when there are no banks. There's not even a common currency. So he's got Portuguese coins and Spanish dollars and coppers, and he's got colonial paper money. And he's also buying and selling and loaning. He's loaning his own money sometimes. He's also borrowing money to purchase property. And he kind of purchases this property that he ends up with in Haddam Neck in kind of bits and pieces and smaller chunks. And he buys it and he earns enough money to pay back the loan, and he buys a little bit more. And so that's really just a story of how any colonial person would have acquired property. But it's also interesting that he really understands that property in that period is the key. That's where your assets are. That's what generates your income. And so that's what's really remarkable about the story as well.
And what do we know about any kind of education that he received while he was growing up on these different farms and properties?
Yeah, that's an area where scholars have not been able to, definitely know the answer to that. There's no evidence in the historical record that he received any formal education. But then again, I think if a student was to ask that question, they could look to this and look for clues about, because clearly the complexity of the colonial economy meant he had to have learned at least how to convert different kinds of, money and dollars and to make transactions, economic transactions. So I feel like he must have been a natural at math, even if he didn't get any formal education in it. He never signs his name and always marks an X. So it's hard to know how literate he is. But again, when you take the sum total of his success and the kind of work he does and the complexity of his economic dealings, he clearly was a very intelligent and entrepreneurial person.
Mm-hmm. Elizabeth, I'm curious, what was the reaction to his success from white residents at the time when you contrast how blacks were treated in the South?
The evidence that he presents in his narrative indicate that he in Haddam and East Haddam, in the community where he ended up as a free man, that he had a lot of very trusting business relationships where he could trust his white business partner and they trusted him. So that's, I think, an indication in the local community how he was treated. But there are examples that he tells about how he's cheated. And there's an example with an Alicia Hart in Saybrook where he's merely a passenger on a passage to, he's heading to New London, and they stop in Saybrook to unload a couple of hogsheads of molasses, and one of them falls into the river, into the water, and is ruined. And even though he was just a passenger on the boat, he's made to take responsibility, financial responsibility for that. And he tries to fight it, and he wants to hire a lawyer, and he's sort of advised, like, I'm sorry, but this guy Hart is going to just until you will have spent more money on lawyers than you've spent on this hogshead of molasses. So you should just kind of eat this. And he's bitter about that, as he should be. So it's a kind of an example where it's not smooth sailing for him, for sure. But at the same time, there are positive and productive relationships he has with fellow, white colonial people in the era.
You're listening to Where We Live. My guest today, Elizabeth Norman. She's the author of Venture Smith's Colonial Connecticut. This was a man who was enslaved as a boy, would end up being taken to New England, eventually living in our state as a freedman. And she has written a book for students, Venture Smith's Colonial Connecticut. We're going to talk more about how we know so much about Venture's life right after the break, and later efforts in our state to require courses in high schools for students to learn Black and Latino history. You can join our conversation too. Have you heard of Venture Smith before? Join us at 888-720-9677 or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel, broadcasting remotely. My guest today is Elizabeth Norman, author of the book Venture Smith's Colonial Connecticut. He was once enslaved, but he bought his freedom and would go on to own land in the Haddam, Connecticut area in 1775. Elizabeth, how do we know so much about Venture's history? I mentioned at the top that he actually had an autobiography.
Yes, and I want to kind of make a slight correction, which is that if you on the book cover, the first author who's listed is Venture Smith himself. So I want to be clear that the first two parts, half of the book, is Venture Smith's own narrative as published in 1798. I have revised it slightly for grade level reading, but I have not novelized it. I have not added anything. I have really tried to stay very close so that this is truly his voice. And then the part that I wrote, our chapter, the second part's the third part of the book, it backs up to tell students about the founding of Connecticut, including the Native American part of the story. One of the important things to me is that this represents colonial Connecticut's founding really as three groups of people. Of course, the Europeans, the British, and the Dutch, but the Native Americans who have been here for 10,000 years, and then the Africans and African Americans, both enslaved and free. I also want to emphasize that. So Venture Smith's story is published by the New London Bee in 1798. And it's the earliest of the, I'll call them freedom narratives from Connecticut people. And I believe it really is published at that time because that is a time of great change. We're a new state of Connecticut. Slavery is kind of on the wane, but is still legal in Connecticut until 1848. But there's really a spirit of freedom that comes out of the American Revolution. But there's just a lot of change happening in Connecticut. And I think it was published at that time when people are getting nervous, I want to say, about the increasing number of free Black people in Connecticut. Suddenly the social control of slavery is not there and they're worried. And this is very much a story, I think, that is meant to be reassuring that free Black people are going to be doing what free Black people are always going to do, or Black people, period, is, just living their lives, having their families, pursuing their dreams within the challenges and confines of a place that is not completely hospitable. And that's really why we end up with the story. And it's really been known about forever. Since then, I don't think it's ever really fallen out of historians' knowledge. But to me, it represented a real opportunity to foreground the African American voice and part of this story, to understand colonial Connecticut in a completely new way, a place that really starts with at least three important groups of people, very different trajectories, very intertwined, all contributing to what has made Connecticut what it is today.
So, Elizabeth, tell me more about when his narrative was published. Who did he dictate his story to?
Well, again, we don't know exactly. It was not revealed or written down. There's been some, we know who published it, but we don't know who wrote it down for him. And we also don't know if they were, to what extent they might have inserted their own opinions. I think that's maybe why it's either it tells us what Venture wanted us to know about his life, or maybe in fact what the person who wrote it down wanted us to know about his life. But again, I think it's a kind of a political statement. It's unusual from some other narratives in that it doesn't have a strong religious. It isn't here as kind of a religious tract, which makes it, I think, remarkable as well.
You've written this book. Again, you have the words of Venture Smith included as well, and Venture Smith's Colonial Connecticut, with the extra context that you mentioned that you've written. You've written it for students. Why do you think it's important for them to hear this perspective in their school?
Again, I think because, well, first of all, let me back up to say that the social studies frameworks that the State Board of Education, State Department of Education in Connecticut has issued in 2015 calls in fifth grade for students to study Native American stories, English settlement through the Revolutionary War. So this same time period where Venture is here. But it asks further. He said, asks a few questions. How do Americans define freedom and equality, and how have American conceptions of freedom and equality changed over the course of U.S. history for various members of various racial, ethnic, religious, and gender minority groups? Is America a land of political, economic, and social opportunity? What was the significance of Connecticut's contribution to the American story? Is the United States a just society, and how has the concept of justice evolved over time? And this, Venture Smith tells us he provides such a wonderful opportunity for students to explore those very complex questions. So it just seemed to me like a great opportunity to really look at Connecticut history and our state's founding and our nation's founding from a really different perspective than kids are usually finding.
So tell us more about Venture Smith. What happened to him?
So he lives out his life in Haddam Neck, eventually amassing 134 acres, which is by any measure of a colonial person is successful. He's growing rye and wheat and corn. He's got an orchard, he has livestock, he's got a fishing business, he's continuing to do wood cutting. There's a wonderful booklet. It was a archaeological site, and so a lot of evidence about what his life there was like is the result of archaeological exploration, and that publication is available online. But at the end of his life, at the end of the narrative, he says, "I am now 69 years old. Though once straight and tall, measuring without shoes 6 feet 1 inch and a half, and every way well proportioned, I am now bowed down with age and hardship. But amidst all my griefs and pains, I have many consolations. Meg, the wife of my youth, whom I married for love and bought with my money, is still alive. My freedom is a privilege which nothing else can equal. I am now possessed of more than 100 acres of land and 3 habitable dwelling houses. It gives me joy to think I have and that I deserve so good a character, especially for truth and integrity. And I think that passage is just so wonderful because he tells us what's important to him. And what's important to him is his family, his wife. It's important his economic success, and it's important that his character is so well recognized. And we see that too in the gravestones that are in the churchyard in East Haddam at the Congregational Church. And so, again, there's many opportunities for kids to, I think the important thing and what kids have said too is you can learn about colonial history here. You really understand a man, you understand his humanity, you understand his strong sense of self, you feel his quest for freedom. He tells us what that means to him. You see throughout his life agency and resistance. He's in some ways he ends up being typical of a colonial man, and yet he is so not typical. So there's a complexity there that I think really is a rich opportunity for education.
Now remind us, he died in 1805, so long before Connecticut actually abolished slavery, Elizabeth.
Yes. And it passed a gradual emancipation law in 1784, and what that meant was that anyone born into slavery after 1784 would be freed when they became 21 years of age. So slavery was on its way out in Connecticut, and so more and more African Americans were becoming free in this period. But it's also, it's a challenging period. And I think what's interesting is for then 8th grade that is now studying that next period is to look at, say, the Constitution of 1818. Why does Connecticut wait, 30 years to adopt a state constitution? Why is that constitution completely silent about slavery? Next door, New York had abolished it in 1817, the year before. We know this is very much, Connecticut and Rhode Island are the last New England states to abolish slavery. This is very much in the kind of public sense of, what's happening now. So it's very, very rich and interesting period.
Mm. We know that scholars and researchers have taken an interest in Venture Smith and other enslaved people over the last few decades. But tell us more about what is left. You mentioned the tombstones in East Haddam, but what about his property? What do we know about that, Elizabeth?
Well, the property is actually not open to the public because it ended up that nuclear power plant there was on this piece of property. So while it has been explored as an archaeological site, it's not a site that you can visit. You can see it, and kind of in the front inside cover of the book, I took a photograph kind of across the Salmon River to the property where it would have been. There's also at the East Haddam Historical Society, they have a chest that has come down through the family. Also, I think one of the most wonderful legacies is every year East Haddam hosts a Venture Smith Day, and his descendants come and join that celebration every year of Venture Smith's life. And the book, I have a little photograph of some of the descendants one of the years, because I think for kids, again, this is a wonderful reminder that, there are still living descendants that have carried on Venture Smith's life and legacy.
You can see part of Elizabeth Norman's book again on our website, wnpr.org/where we live. Tell us about the picture on the cover.
Yes, because there are no photographs, of course, from the colonial period. Photography wouldn't be invented for another 100 years or so. I commissioned an artist, Michael Borders, to create the cover illustration, and there's 4 illustrations on the inside cover. He lives in Bloomfield and is a bit of an historian himself, and so he was wonderful to work with. He used his grandson as one of the models for one of the boys in the picture. And so it was important to me to try, it's a beautifully illustrated book. We're on radio, so you can't see, but it has charts and graphs and historic maps, but also these 5 illustrations that Michael Borders did. And I'm very grateful for his thoughtfulness and sensitivity in creating those illustrations. They're beautiful.
This is a great resource for students in our state and also adults, Elizabeth. I'm curious what students have shared with you as they've learned Venture Smith's story.
And we piloted the book in a 5th grade in Middletown and in the 7th grade in East Haddam. And we have a number of those quotes from students on the venturesmithscolonialct.org, our website. And what they tell us, I'll read one from a 5th grader. This book is good because it tells us what life was like back in our own state of Connecticut. Venture Smith was a very hardworking man. I liked learning about his family. Colonial times were very tough, which of course completely encapsulates a lot of the message of Venture's life. And a 7th grader said, part of learning about people, at least for me, is being able to put myself in their shoes and understand why they did what they did and how difficult it was for them to do it. I wanted to learn more. And I think the gratifying thing to me was that, so what we did was we had set it up where they had to write me a letter after they had done this, used the resource, and they had to tell me what they liked about it and what could be improved, what I could do better with it. And this was before we went to press with it. So we actually did take into account a number of their suggestions for improvement. But they really did find the story as compelling as I did. And you really got a sense that they connected with who Venture Smith was as a person, and that they had that experience where history isn't just this facts and figures and timelines and laws and this, that, that it was lived by real people, and they had real struggles and they had real triumphs. And that's all that I had hoped that it would accomplish.
I also think it's interesting with this book when we think about how we've all learned history, and important not to only see it from the Eurocentric lens, Elizabeth.
Yes, absolutely. Because African Americans have been in Connecticut from the beginning of the colony, from the, and they have, there's also, importantly, slavery is not the only part of that story. There's Ruth and Philip Moore in Hartford in the 1600s were free landowning African American family. And so I also try to emphasize the freedom part of the story as well.
Well, we're going to be learning more about efforts in Connecticut to expand the type of history that high school students are learning coming up right after the break. But Tom is calling in from Manchester. Tom, we just have under a minute. Go ahead with your comment or question.
Yes, good morning. I'm just commenting. I'm of African American background. I'm glad that your book came out because it was a previous one in 2012 by 2 white college professors from Eastern Connecticut State University, but I guess it went out of print. I remember buying that. But The Bone and Sinew of the Land and New England Bound by Wendy Warren and The Bone and the Sinew of the Land by Annalisa Cox, both white female historians, talk about what you had talked about free blacks, bone and sinew of the land in the West that were discriminated against in Indiana and 5 other states. That came out 2 years ago. And the other one, Wendy Warren, talked about Connecticut being involved in the slave trade along with Rhode Island and some others. That came out in 2016, New England Bound. But I'm glad for Venture Smith and others that achieved against the odds. And also James Moore was another black man that spoke out against injustice in Connecticut in the late 1790s, and we had Richard Pennington and others, and I guess the black 29th and 30th regiments that fought in the Civil War. So we have achieved against the odds, and with the Fugitive Slave Act, I think that's another bad part of our history that should never have been proved by the Supreme Court. When I saw the movie Harriet a few years ago, about a year and a half ago, but we've achieved throughout the odds, and we've defended this country and contributed. So I think we need to just, have a good balance there, that we're here to stay, and fight, discrimination. We've made our mark in different ways, and I'll end on this. The 95th anniversary of Black History Month coming up next month, from Carter G. Woodson. He passed away many years ago, but he started that in 1926. So,
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for calling in today here on Where We Live. I've been speaking with Elizabeth Norman. She is the co-author of Venture Smith's Colonial Connecticut, and she's publisher of Connecticut Explored. Coming up after the break, Connecticut has a law to broaden the history taught in high schools. Now, what kind of Black and Latino history did you learn about growing up? You can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We've spent some time learning about Venture Smith, who died a free man in Connecticut in 1805. Historian and author Elizabeth Norman was telling us about her book for students about Venture Smith's life in Connecticut. Also, the book includes his own narrative and his own words. Now, students in our state may learn about him because of work by Norman, but how are other students learning about Black and Latino history today? Joining us on Zoom is Dr. Benjamin Foster. He's an adjunct faculty member at Central Connecticut State University, and where he teaches African American studies and religion. Dr. Foster, welcome to the show.
Thank you so very much for having me.
I understand just this past December, Connecticut became the first state in the nation to require all high schools to offer courses on African American, Black, Puerto Rican, and Latino studies. You were part of that journey to get this requirement in place. Tell us what prompted you to get involved.
Well, first of all, let me tell you how pleased I am to be on the program with Elizabeth. She has done such groundbreaking work, and I just want to salute her. We became involved in the project in 2018. I broached Dr. James Thompson, who's the superintendent of schools in Bloomfield, with my idea that we ought to try and get African American history on the legislative docket. So that our kids would have to take this course. And so we began to organize, and we got people such as Dr. Walton Brown Foster, who's a professor at Central Connecticut State University, Dr. Stacy Close, and others, historians from around the state, to meet with us in October of 2018. We knew that 2019 represented the 400th year of African American tenure in these United States. And so we wanted to have it coincide with the 400-year celebration and commemoration that would be occurring all around the nation. And we were able to do that. We convened in January of 2019 at the Legislative Office Building. We had gotten Representative Bobby Gibson to really take this bull by the horn and move it through the legislative process, along with Senator Douglas McCorry. The legislation was approved, and we began to work with the State Education Resource Center, known as CERC, to develop the curriculum content for African American studies. Along the way, I was able to contact some of my Latino and Puerto Rican friends, and we got them to also become involved with the effort to write the curriculum content for Latino and Puerto Rican studies.
Dr. Foster, I understand that the Connecticut State Board of Education has approved the curriculum for this course. That was the final step needed to implement the requirement. So can you give us an idea of what students will be learning if they elect to take the course in high school?
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that it is an elective. We weren't able to get it mandated, but students will be able to, as it pertains to the African American component, it will be in two semesters. The first semester, the students will be taught African American studies. The second semester, they will be taught the Latino Puerto Rican component. But we start off in the African American component by teaching our students that we all have a common ancestor based on archaeological and anthropological knowledge, that the oldest human ancestor came out of Africa. And we do that so that our students will feel some commonality. We let them know that Homo erectus, the ancestor of Homo sapiens, first stood up and walked in Africa. We talk about some of the African empires and the Egyptian civilization. We talk about the Moors in Spain. We let them know that there were internecine warfare in Africa, which led to enslavement. So we want the kids to know that it was not all caused by European merchants and slave traders, that Africans did have some role in the enslavement of their brethren. But we are quick to let the students know in the curriculum that Africans were not a monolithic people. And that's a part of the false narrative. So we are trying to eradicate the false narratives as it pertains to African American people, that there were all types of ethnic groups. There were over 1,000 languages spoken on the continent. We moved rapidly to 1619 and what took place there. We talk about the Middle Passage. It's not victimization. Many people are fearful of the curriculum because they think that it's about victimization. No, it deals with certainly what happened to the people, the Middle Passage, and what they endured, and having to be seasoned in the West Indies prior to being sold in North America. But we talk about some of the triumphs, the survival. And then we go on to talk about some of the vast contributions that African Americans have made to these United States in their 400-year tenure here. And so that's some of the information that will be given to our kids. We talk about the post-Obama period. We talk about Connecticut. We go into a little more detail about the great people that came out of Connecticut who made an indelible mark on African American history, both black and white. We talk about Harriet Beecher Stowe, John Brown. We talk about Lemuel Haynes, the first African American to be ordained by a mainline church denomination, Presbyterians. He was also a Revolutionary War patriot, born in West Hartford, Connecticut. We talk about Chuck Stone, the great journalist who helped Adam Clayton Powell move through great legislation that enabled people to get more of the things that they were striving for in the civil rights movement. And so I believe it's a tremendous curriculum. There always is room for improvement, but we've started something that I believe will enable our children to have a better understanding of one another's stories.
You mentioned Dr. Foster, that this is an elective. Are you worried that many students are still going to miss out on all of this great information that you just shared?
Well, certainly I am, but we've made it very clear to the State Board of Education that we will need intensive professional development for teachers, and that there needs to be ongoing outreach to superintendents and instructional leaders of schools. principals. Having been a principal myself, I know what it entails. You have to work with the teachers and those in guidance to let them know how important the course is and have the buy-in that's necessary. In 2006, as the district coordinator for social studies in a school district, I developed curriculums and in the same topics that we're discussing today. And we saw that it required the counselors being involved, really seeing the value of the courses. And that will have to be done. And it will take, as I said before, the buy-in from superintendents, from principals, counselors, and of course, parents will have to understand what the curriculum is all about.
I understand that high schools will begin offering this in the fall of 2022. Before we run out of time, I wanted to ask Elizabeth Norman your thoughts on these courses that will be offered along the lines of it's so important to make this history accessible to all.
Well, I can't agree more, and I know I'm 100% with Dr. Foster, who would like to see this history taught in all grades, and that's part of why we have included African American history in our third grade book, and again, Venture Smith, because it's for fifth grade, around the fifth grade curriculum, it happens to focus on the colonial period, but we have quite a lot of resources around Connecticut's African American history up through the 20th century on the Connecticut Explored website. We've covered that often in the magazine because it's great American history. And so, yeah, I'm with Dr. Foster, who I know would love to see this really mandated for all grades. And I know he's working. I think that's, I don't want to speak for him. I think that's his next objective.
Dr. Foster, we just have 2 minutes left, and so final thoughts as we think about again this course being offered in high schools soon, another year or so.
That's correct. Let me just say that I believe that our children and youth need to be totally aware of one another's culture in order for our nation to reach its maximum potential promise of democracy and enable all of us to achieve the American dream in our ever increasing nanotechnological society. And I believe that when our children begin to see themselves and their significant group in a more positive light, especially those young people who are marginalized, it will enable them to be inspired to fulfill their aims and aspirations. I first wanted to do this while serving as a principal of a predominantly Black high school, and we were trying to get our kids to really do better in math and science. And I would often hear the kids saying that the information that our teachers were trying to get them to really absorb was for whites. Mm-hmm. And so I began the effort then to let them know about the Black scientists and others who have made contributions to America. It's just not in our textbooks. And as
well, thank you, Dr. Foster. Thank you so much for telling us about your work, and we can't wait to follow up and see how this curriculum rolls out in just another year. Dr. Benjamin Foster, and also Elizabeth Norman, publisher of Connecticut Explored. Today's show produced by Tess Terrible. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel.